Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Medventions lecture series. I'm very pleased to be introducing our speaker today, Brian Bloom, who will be speaking with us about a very essential topic in medical technology innovation and commercialization, the process of identifying potential investors and understanding their unique requirements, as well as determining the best way to reach out to them and pitch your ideas. Brian is the co-founder of Bloom, Burton & Co. and serves as the firm's chairman and chief executive officer. By forging unique relationships with international healthcare specialized investors, Brian raises capital for Canadian healthcare companies while helping investors realize returns. Brian is a member of the Life Sciences Advisory Board at the National Research Council of Canada and also serves on the board of directors of Biotic Canada and the Baycrest Foundation. Before co-founding Bloom Burton in 2008, Brian spent 6 years at Dundee Securities in the healthcare and biotechnology institutional sales and equity research groups. He received an honors Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry from the McMaster University and subsequently studied at the Mount Sinai Graduate School for Biological Sciences of New York University with a focus in molecular endocrinology and biophysics. Brian, thank you very much for being our guest lecturer tonight. We're looking forward to your talk.
That's very nice. Can you all hear me? All right. Centered on the screen. I've never been taped before. This is not very good, because I often say incredibly inappropriate things. So, okay, good. All right, well, thank you very much. I split this talk up. Actually, a lot of the things that you wanted me to speak about are not in this presentation, but I will speak about them. And actually, what I'm hoping for, too, is that we whiz through this presentation and that you all have really good questions, because I think some of the most important information comes out through Q&A. So we'll leave lots of time for that, which, of course, is an excuse for me to do a short presentation. Okay, so I'd like to talk about myself. I've been told that many of you are biophysicists. I'm a failed biophysicist. And I'd like to talk about my firm, because I think that's rather relevant as to where we sit in the ecosystem of investors, and then we will talk about medical technology, investment, venture capital, and the process and things like that. Good. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so as mentioned, I went to McMaster University. I graduated with biochemistry. I always wanted to be a doctor, at least my mother thought I should be. And instead of doing so, I didn't do so. So that made her quite upset. And I've always wanted to move to New York. Not sure. I just want to be on Broadway or something like that. So I went to New York and I applied to a whole bunch of graduate schools, Mount Sinai School of Medicine being one. And I spent about 3 years and I did well. I published in science. I had probably the best grade in the course. But like Beaker the Muppet, I blew up everything in the lab and I was really horrible at doing science. Very good at writing science, talking about science, understanding science, really stinky at doing science. So I went on a quest to figure out what I was going to do with my life. So it wasn't medicine, it certainly wasn't academic research. And I learned after looking at pharmaceutical industry and law, like patent law, I discovered that Wall Street has thousands of people who do nothing but analyze medical technologies, biotechnologies, pharmaceutical companies as specialists, right? Like they have a domain expertise in medical science, or they have a medical degree or a PhD or something like that. And I wanted to do that. So I wanted to be at the intersection of where the investment world intersects with the scientific world. I then moved back to Toronto after starting my career on Wall Street for a few years, joined Dundee Securities, and then in 2008, which was a neat time to launch a new banking firm, we launched Bloom Burton. So the whole purpose of Bloom Burton, and the reason that myself and my partner Joan Burton launched the firm, is to accelerate the path to monetization of healthcare. Sounds cliched, but it actually is a very meaningful statement to us. It's why we exist. Every single company, whether it be a generic company, a pharmaceutical company, a software company, tiny startup R&D company, or an instrumentation company, dreams of getting to that monetization event that crystallizes value for them and their investors. And a monetization event doesn't necessarily need to be a sale of the company to a big evil corporation. It could be getting to profitability, being public on a stock exchange, being able to close that amazing big venture capital round, getting regulatory approval, All of those are monetization events. And we offer these 7 services that all help Canadian healthcare companies accelerate their path to monetization. First of our services is capital raising. So we are the largest raiser of capital in Canada. So we do initial public offerings, private placements. People hire us because we know almost every global healthcare investor who look to us to find great companies to invest in Canada. Our second service is merger and acquisition advisory. I'm sure we're ranked number 1 at that in healthcare in Canada. So we represent companies as they try to partner with, license, or sell themselves, buy and sell assets or divisions with multinationals. Equity research, we're that firm that puts buy and sell recommendations on stocks. I think we're ranked number 1 in Canada. 2 and 3 are RBC and TD, I think. So we're incredibly reputable in our research, which is disseminated to thousands of investors globally, as we recommend. And we do have some Medtech companies under coverage. Next, sales and trading. So that's what I do. I don't do the trading part. So I am Canada's only healthcare salesperson. So my job is, even though I know lots of companies and I'm very useful to companies, my job is to serve investors. So I spend most of my time where medical specialized investors are: New York, Boston, San Francisco. Yeah, I made it back to and I'm there almost every place. And London, places like that, where unlike Canada, where like we have 6 VCs that actually look at healthcare, in the United States and in elsewhere, there are hundreds of funds and thousands of individuals who do private equity, venture capital, lending. They run hedge funds, billions of dollars, all just for healthcare. And I know them all. So that's my job. And I do the sales aspect. Monetization planning is we have a whole consulting arm. So we plan for monetization events. And so we give a lot of scientific and medical advice to companies. And we do direct investing. So we actually have a $50 million fund ourselves. The Burton funds, we do loans and direct investments in public companies. And we also, finally, create and incubate entirely new companies from scratch, because we are a very large team of scientific and medical people. So I don't want you to think we're Wall Street people who, instead of doing mining or oil and gas, decided to do healthcare one day. We're quite the opposite. We're healthcare nerdy folks who decided one day to devote our lives to the investment industry. And we have founded 5 companies in the past 3 years. I'm the chairman of almost all, sit on the board. And one is going public next year. It's quite exciting. None of them are medtech companies, just so you know. Most of them are biotech. Okay. So we have 2 clients: companies that need advice and capital, and investors that want to make, hopefully, positive returns in the healthcare sector. These are all the people we have about 25 people at the firm. This is most of them. And as I mentioned, most of us have a background in we have physicians and scientists. We have a dozen PhD scientists. We employ people with patent and regulatory expertise. One of our partners worked at FDA for a couple of years, so we have a lot of expertise in that way. All of our services are delivered because of our methodology of being able to deeply understand what it is we're selling. Right? There's nothing worse than a stockbroker or a banker that does blockchain one day and then biotech the next day. They generally don't know what they're talking about. We do, because it's all we do. We're very comfortable, number 2, across all funding structures. So we've worked with private companies, public companies. We've issued equity, debt, converts, and preferred share structures, and all sorts of nifty things. And number 3, we've also worked all over the world with international investors, international pharmaceutical and multinational firms. And we've helped Canadian companies list on NASDAQ and on the London exchanges. So lots of cross-border experience. Number 4, I've already talked about how I have relationships with healthcare specialized investors that, unlike Lumira and BDC and a few other firms, don't really exist in Canada. We do a lot to engage the whole healthcare industry. I'll get to that on the next slide. And we're creative and entrepreneurial ourselves, which helps when you're trying to advise other startup companies. So we've done billions of dollars in transactions, but here, whether it's Hamilton Thorne or LED Dental or Response Biomedical or Profound Medical or Titan, we've done a lot with medtech companies. I thought I'd put some of our transactions up on the screen. Going back to what we do for the community, very important, you know, that not only do we sit on boards, we mentor students, we lecture, and we we participate in panels and things like that. We also hold a lot of events which are very important to the sector. Bloom Burton Healthcare Investor Conference is the leading healthcare investor event in Canada. We had 1,000 people come out to Toronto last year. And we also just launched the Bloom Burton Award Gala, which Cameron Piran of Synaptive was one of our finalists. He didn't win. I think he'll win soon because he's remarkable. Going back to our conference, of the 66 companies that presented our conference, including startups and big companies like Apotex, about 10 are Medtech companies. So, you know, Bo and Armin and Brian, your professor here, Dr. Horton, and you know, and Cameron, they all presented our conference. And it's hundreds of investors in the room, and that's our job, right? So that's a great event. Okay, medical technology commercialization. So before we talk about financing, we have to talk about what commercialization is all about. You probably already had a lecture about this, right? Patenting and all that, but I think it's important. And I haven't given you my views on commercialization. So firstly, especially with bozos in the government, everyone uses all these words interchangeably because no one knows what they mean. But we know what they mean. Or after this talk, you're going to know what they mean. So the first is invention and discovery. So understanding information or figuring out a disease process or an engineering concept that's never been known before is what invention and discovery are. It's generally the purview of academic researchers, but not necessarily. You know, there are people who invent and discover things in industry all the time. Innovation is using inventions and discoveries in novel ways to solve problems. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a commercial aspect to that innovation, right? Innovation could be folding a paperclip in a new way and jimming a door open or something like that. That's innovative, but it's, you know, you can't really sell those. Maybe you can on eBay. Translation, we all know, is bench to bedside. So it could be figuring out, could be commercialization, but translation actually means, you know, going from discovery or the bench to the bedside, where it's the application of a new treatment paradigm, a new protocol for treatment. It doesn't also necessarily mean commercialization. Commercialization is my favorite because it invariably, you know, leverages inventions, innovations, and translation, but it's all for profit, which is, you know, in a capitalist society, how the most products and services are disseminated at the lowest cost to the most people. And that's the best good for society, and that's why commercialization is so important. But it's also how it's different than these other things. So when we look at the healthcare landscape, I would like to define for you how I define medical technology. So therapeutic R&D or biotech is generally small molecules. You know, it's drugs. It's drug R&D. And we're going to be talking a lot about drug products today as I compare and contrast it to medical technology, because medical technology is kind of the, you know, the red-headed stepchild to the very flashy biotech industry. Therapeutic commercialization. This is big pharma. This is specialty pharma, like Knight Therapeutics and you know, and Pfizer. And manufacturing companies that have revenue and profits, and of course they do R&D, but they also do a lot of commercialization. Medical technology to us is devices, diagnostics, imaging, and research instrumentation. So I think that's what we're talking about today. Please say yes. Okay, great. Because the whole talk is about it. Healthcare service. Now we work across all these things. Healthcare services are things like labs and clinics and private hospitals and things like that. Labs, of course, use instruments. Many. Healthcare IT, software, and stuff like that. Consumer healthcare stuff, you know, without a lot of evidence, like vitamins and supplements, nonsense, and animal health and industrial biotechnology. So those are the main buckets. So if you actually go to Fidelity in Boston, where I've been many times, they'll have someone in each of these categories and a whole team around them to cover all the stocks and make the investments. And this is usually how things are subsected on the buy side or on the investor side. And there are entire funds, or at investment funds, there are entire groups or a person that is often dedicated to medical technology. You know. Okay, so I don't know if anyone's told you this, but when we think of an innovation or a translation idea, probably only about 10% of what is invented or what is published may have commercial value. And the really sad thing is, well, it's not sad, it's just the way it is, and that's okay. And the truth is, of those 10%, once you really do all the market research and you really roll up your sleeves and you look at the competitive and the patent analysis and how it's going to get to market, whether it's going to sell, only one of those 10 can ever really have a good enough, it will stand the test of a diligence exercise, whether it's from us or a venture capitalist, to actually deserve funding. And that, of course, depends on it having, forget about what the asset is, the intellectual property. It needs to have the right people and the right plan to get to market. So commercializing medical technologies is hard. So really, when you go in front of the investor, these are more or less all the boxes that they're going to check. So on the left is all the things that, all the aspects or characteristics that qualify an asset or an idea, the light bulb. It works in a certain way. You have to engineer and you have to prototype it. You have to then clinically validate it. You then need regulatory approval. Got to figure out how to make it. You got to make sure that it's disseminated and available to those who use it. You got to make sure that those that you compete against don't have anything better. And you can articulate that through publications and education. Of course, there needs to be a pharmacoeconomic reason for you to exist or for your company to exist. Save the system money and, kumbaya, all that good stuff. You got to make sure someone pays for it. And you got to make sure that the infrastructure is in place for distribution and for use. And it's got to be easy to use and convenient. You got to own it too. And not only that, at the end of the day, and that's, you have to know that all of this is going to be the case up front. And then you better hope that after you test it and put it through a battery of demonstrations, it is safe, efficacious, and it's at the end of it, those safety and efficacy data has a commercial or competitive reason to exist. And then you need the right people and the money to move it from left to right, which is generally from idea to market. So it's tough, it's really tough. And VCs see a ton of these things, and angel investors, and we'll get to it. Okay, so the good news is, whether it's devices, drugs, or instruments, or healthcare software, we happen to be, you young, sprightly people, happen to be coming of age in probably the best time ever. So if you were software coders, that was so 10 years ago. But now is the time for biology, for solving diseases. Now is the time when things like the tools that we use to understand diseases have never been cheaper or more powerful and more disseminated. Our ability to diagnose and segment patients and increase the probability of success of how we're testing and demonstrating the value of products has never been higher. It is already leading to, I know I just have 3 drug examples, sorry, no devices. But transformational disease-modifying therapies and products are coming to market. We've never had more capital available through the public markets and the private markets, and a friendlier regulatory regime. It's not like Vioxx was pulled from market or Fen last year. We have an FDA which is very, very friendly and wants good products to come to market. So we have everything going for us. Okay, here's the problem with Medtech. So this is the life cycle. This makes sense, right? You have an idea, and then you do ideation, and you do preclinical and prototype testing, and then that little red and black people stick figures, that's supposed to be clinical testing, and then you get regulatory approval, and then you launch, and you launch sales until you get to the big green circle, which is profits. Well, here's the problem for everyone in this room. If you are developing a drug, you de-risk every step of the way. Okay, you have an idea, you file a patent, great, more value. You run a mouse model, great, more value. You demonstrate it in a human, more value. You get approval, great. You launch it, people buy it, even if you're not profitable for 10 years, way more value. You reach profitability, if you're not sold by then, great. Money to be made or value to be crystallized every step of the way. The way that investors, and I don't think anyone's ever told you this, sees the red-headed ugly stepchild of Medtech, where you all sit, is that once you have that bright idea, you're the red at the bottom, okay? Once you have your prototype, it's already assumed that it works because it's physics, right? So Once you demonstrate in humans, investors go, so what? Of course. And once you get approval, they say, well, of course. What, you screw up manufacturing? Of course you're going to get approval. So the value of what you're doing doesn't really go up until, not even until you launch the darn thing. Because then, it's all about, oh, we have sales, we have 1 million sales, 3 million sales. So what? It's not really until you get a lot of sales momentum and profitability that you have a big value inflection point. And the other problem is the multinationals, your multinationals, the Boston Scientifics and the Medtronics and the J&Js and all those, they're very lazy. They don't really do R&D anymore. They do some R&D. They don't do a lot of R&D. Unlike the Pfizers and Celgenes of the world, that do their own R&D and scouting the world for the next hottest cancer cure in phase 1 and plunking down $1 billion to buy companies in phase 2. Device companies don't do that. So if you're a venture capitalist or an angel investor, buckle up, baby, because you're not really getting a monetization event until you're profitable. Your lazy multinationals don't buy companies when they're in clinical testing, and they generally don't buy them when they're at the prototyping or even at the regulatory approval stage. They say, so what? Grow sales, launch it. Let me see what you can do for it. Only then will they say, oh, okay, you've scratched your way to 20 million in global sales, and we'll take it from here. We'll make it into a 200 million. If you actually wanted to monetize it. So, M&A or the idea of partnering with or being able to exit to the public markets in a high value way, or to realize value, even if it's on paper, in a high value way, it's very, very plateaued until you get right to the end, which sucks. I don't even have an answer for you. It just sucks. All right. I'm going the wrong way. Okay. Now, generalist investors often get duped. So specialist investors like me and other VCs and something like that, we know better, but I can't tell you how many, you know what I mean by a generalist investor, like a family office or like a non-healthcare specialized investor. We're often approached, we're called all the time by investors saying, I bought this Medtech company because I was told that unlike drugs, they don't fail as much. It's easier to get them approved. And I said, well, yeah, all of that is true, you idiot, but the risk for a drug company or most medical companies, whether it's a service or a drug or a biologic or a vaccine, is in the clinical stages, right? You got to prove that you cure mice and cure humans and you're building value every step of the way. The major risk for medtech companies is not that the darn thing works. Again, investors should expect that's a fait accompli because of your brilliant physicists and engineers in the audience here. The risk is at the end. It's commercial. It's at the end when you've done everything, if you can actually sell it and whether anyone actually wants to buy it. And you don't really get rewarded along the way. So medtech is all about execution, and we already know it works. These are things that investors get tricked with all the time. And I got to talk them out of it. I'm like, no, medtech's actually really hard. Or my favorite one, I didn't even put it on this slide, medtech, the development cycle's quicker. Well, yes, that can be true. It could take 10 years to bring a drug to market. You could engineer and get a 510K approval for a medical device in 4 years or something like that. But the fun is just beginning when you got to launch the damn thing, right? Okay. All right. The problem with Canada is there's not a lot of capital here. If you are a mining company or an oil and gas company, you're digging stuff out of the ground, man, there's billions of dollars for you. You cannot, if you're mining biology, good luck. There's not a lot of money. But there are VCs in Canada that do healthcare, and many of them, which I've highlighted, do medical technologies, and the slides will be available. And I've also put a dark blue circle around my friends in the venture community who do not only do medical devices, but do a lot of it. Epic Capital and IGAN. I mean, all Sam does is just imaging devices. Lumira, Peter and his team are very, very wise at medical device investing. And BDC, usually half of their portfolio is medical device. So we do have. I put up something here. This is kind of useless information, but this just shows that I asked one of my analysts to make the slide today. He left off the most important information, which was 2000 through 2007. which really was a nuclear winter for medtech investing. So you see on the left there where it's kind of a gradual climb, it's coming off of a climb from really a sad state of affairs, where in the 80s and 90s, there was actually probably more medtech venture capital available than biology and drugs and biologics and things like that until people started figuring out these are kind of walking dead companies while they're in development, unlike the drug companies. And in the 2000s, things really bottomed up. But we've had a nice recovery. Unfortunately, though, you can see some of the deal values have gone up, especially in 2013. That means that VCs are starting to put what this doesn't really represent, but I've seen the data. So we're seeing fewer bets in more companies. So companies like Synaptive, the really good winners, they kind of get more of their share, and kind of the stinky companies don't. They may get funded, but not as well. So there's also differences geographically. So you got to know your audience when you're. No, I'm not talking about the Lumiras and the Epics and IGANs and ones who specialize in medtech, but in general, just because your neighbors, your rich uncles, your family offices, your foundations, your generalist investors, there's massive investment pools from the general society, right? Stockbrokers and things like that. Right now in Canada, thanks to Valiant and Martin Shkreli and the evil speculators, pharma's kind of like bottom of the barrel in Canada. It's number 5. And healthcare IT, thanks to Shopify and some cool techie companies in Canada, if you're a health techie company, you're kind of, you're golden. So there's actually a lot of money out there for health IT. And health services, there's profitable clinics and labs and things like that. Biotech and medtech are kind of in the middle bottom. So anything really R&D-ish, not a lot of money for you in Canada, minus from those few funds that I've just overviewed. Global investors, or at least in the United States, where I spend a lot of my time, where people are a little bit more sophisticated in healthcare investing, everything's turned on its head. Healthcare services are at the bottom because nobody knows what's going on with Obamacare and hospitals and who's going to have the money to provide services and pay for them. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's at the bottom. Biotech, there's nothing hotter in the United States than the biotech sector. I'd say that globally. And medtech is kind of smushed in the middle. Of course, if you really want to talk about the healthcare industry in Canada, that really has investor attention. It's cannabis, which I don't think is a real healthcare sector, but it's kind of on the periphery. So, interestingly, my business partner Jolyon Burton told me just as I was coming here that IBM just announced that they launched a new effort to combine blockchain for security in the cannabis industry. So talking about trying to put every buzzword into one new venture. Okay, so what investors actually want to hear. So let's go through this and then we're almost done. And then I'll talk about the things that aren't in the presentation. So the most important thing that investors, not just medtech, but a lot of these comments are specific to medtech. So what investors really want to hear is a clear value proposition as to why you're differentiated and why you can do something that no one else can, or that other people can, but you can do it better, cheaper, hopefully both. Okay? So it's all about differentiation. And the problem with medtech is you're also, if you have a new way to treat a patient with an implant or a new balloon or a stent or something, you're not just competing against other devices. You have to do your homework to make sure that you understand that you are competitive against every other surgical technique or pharmacological approach that is going after that same patient population. Because you're not just elbowing against, the Medtronics and St. Jude's and Guidance and whatever, half of those companies work, the Abbotts of the world. You got to make sure that you're competitive against any approach that can treat that patient. The other, something that's unique to medtech is my third point. You have to actually have a clear-ish understanding as to how it will be commercialized, even when you're at the ideation phase, as to your thoughts on competitive pricing, distribution channels, who's going to be using it, who at the hospital or the clinic or in the community is the buyer, how you're going to persuade them, to purchase your device instead of someone else's. And that's unfair, but true. And it's because of what I said before, that uniqueness in medical technology, which make it very difficult and stinky, that you generally won't be rewarded for the value you're creating until the end. And you better buckle up and prepare to commercialize yourself. So even when you're at the earliest stages, you have to be able to understand who your user is, who makes the decisions as to whether it's good value, and things of that nature. Saving the system or improving outcomes, of course. Also, more so than drugs, you're also going to create a lot of enemies. Like every time I meet with a medtech, oh, who's excited for you to come to market? Oh, the anesthesiologist. Well, who hates the fact you're coming to market? Wow, the radiologist. They're going to lose all sorts of business because I replaced them with mine. Right? So you actually need to know, very importantly, who you're disrupting and whose life you're making better. It's very rare that everyone's life is made better. And again, even when you're at the ideation stage or at the Series A, the very early stages, you do have to be forward thinking about what the cost of goods and what your operating model will be, and ultimately, when you're at peak, what your profitability will be. And at peak means at maturity. So I think we're eventually going to grab a third of a $300 million market, and when we have $100 million in sales, we'll be mature and fully penetrated, and we'll be making $25 million in profit. And this is why, because ultimately that margin and working backwards through some financial model is ultimately how any venture capitalist is going to value you from a forward way, and then work backwards as to what you're worth today. Generally is close to zero. So knowing what your margins are at maturity is very important. And also profitability and contemplated budget to get there. How much money do you need to raise to get to profitability? You have to know that really, really early. Even if it's a guess, and even if it's best assumptions, and even if you amend it along the way as you collect more data and jump from your Series A to your Series B, etc. It's very important, because the investor that you're pitching at the early rounds need to continuously finance you, because there's very little chance to IPO or to M&A or to exit until you're profitable in your industry, which is not true for drugs and not true for biotech or pharma or services and other areas of healthcare that I put up on the screen. It is unique to you that your investors don't get to celebrate until the end, which means even if this round of financing is $5 million, you need to know and tell your investor and be open. Look, we have a $50 million budget, 20 million for development, 30 million for launch. You need to know and try your best to quantify the total capital need. My last point is incrementalism is actually okay in medtech. So the only good news in this is that doing something 20 or 30% better, or saving the system 10 or 30% dollars is okay for medical technology due to the turnover and the replacement cycles and the idea that being better is okay. Whereas in the drug business right now, you better be making a quantum leap in the disease you're going after, because shrinking a tumor by 50% instead of 40% is not going to get rid of it. So incrementalism is not okay in the drug space, but it is in it. Major don'ts. I think I've already touched on many of these. Don't assume that you'll have any chance for liquidity until you're profitable. Don't assume that as you hit milestones, the value of your company will go up. You could, of course, artificially say it goes up, right? You just say, well, it's worth 10 million. Have a prototype, it's worth 20. It's a market. Convince someone. Don't tell the investor what an appropriate return looks like. There's nothing more insulting than saying you deserve make 3 times your money. So, I think that with your money will be worth X, and therefore, the valuation for this round is 1/3 X. That's rude. And also don't underestimate or don't under-articulate or sandbag the capital need. If If it costs 50 million or 150 million to get to profitability and to launch globally, or to get to world domination, then say so. And don't dupe those investors. Don't stop making those comparisons, like just because it's not microscopic molecular medicine compared to biotech or drugs, this is so less risky, because the commercialization risks are massive compared to drug risks. If you have an FDA label that says that you're curing a disease or you've made a huge advance with your pill, it will fly off the shelf, even at a price of $250,000. Not so in medtech. Okay? In medtech, unless you've done something really transformational, which almost nobody does. Even great companies do a bunch of incremental things. No one is really doing quantum leap things in medical technology. The risks are almost entirely commercial. You have to be upfront that the quantum of that risk is very similar, if not more so, than the development of risk. So that's it that I prepared. But you had mentioned a few other things in your introduction that I certainly can talk about. Finding investors. There are incubators and CSIRs and Canadian-funded goofy agencies that our taxpayers fund, like Mars and things like that. This is being recorded. This is when I get in trouble. SimTech and the Center for Probe Development and all these things, MEDAC. There are all these organizations who do catalog who the investors are. Many of them hold events or showcases or competitions. There are also regional economic development agencies in Toronto and Southern Ontario and throughout Canada. There are also trade commissaires. The trade commissioners are incredibly important. So if you're actually trying to reach, and I'll get to the international money, but if you actually are trying to reach that company that makes, that larger company that you're going to compete against, that you may want to speak with about co-development or acquisition or sharing IP, and they're based in Switzerland, or you want to reach that VC in Boston, trade commissioners are very, very useful. And of course, intermediaries, which don't just include investment banking firms like ours, but also, accountants like KPMG and Ernst & Young and PricewaterhouseCoopers and the smaller firms and law firms who your patent lawyers are. They often have international touch points and networks that often include funders and venture capitalists. Of the categories of investors, there are friends, families, and fools galore, rich uncles and the like, and they're very useful to any kind of startup. We raise millions of dollars from individual investors for our companies. There are also family offices now, some that do a lot of medical technology. There's actually a fund in Boston called Broadview. All they do is cardiac devices. It's probably because the patriarch is, maybe they have heart disease in their family or something like that. These do exist. And there are many holding companies and family offices who not only focus on healthcare, but focus just in medical technologies. There's a $25 billion office in Texas. I speak with both Spindletop. They have a whole medical technology team as an example. So they mainly do profitable private equity stuff, not a lot of VC. Which brings us to the obvious ones, venture capitalists. So a lot of what I've just described is how you do engage with the kind of data that's relevant to a venture capitalist. I've already overviewed the ones that are relevant in Canada, which you can count on one hand, or a couple of hands, but the ones that do a lot of health technology, there aren't many of them. In the United States, they do exist, but I must say, when I started my career 17 years ago, I covered a lot of venture capitalists who were medtech specialists. And let me tell you, they don't exist anymore. They don't. You'd be lucky to find some firms that do biotech, that do drug stuff and medtech, like an OrbiMed or a Longitude. But the firms like Silos and others that just used to do, even Kleiner Perkins used to do a ton of imaging and diagnostics, most of them have gone away or have switched strategies. Or ones like Versant that used to do all healthcare, are just focusing on drugs, as an example. And of course, they have a very bright people there. So, it's even though I showed you the global North American VC numbers, how the total numbers of deals are rising, it really, for some reason, isn't reflective of the number of firms that no longer do this. So, and also, this is another thing. When I'm raising money for a drug company, I can go to like Novartis Ventures, Johnson & Johnson, J-Labs, Innovation Ventures Group. It seems that every pharma has a ventures group. Not so in your space. Of course, you look to the larger companies for acquisition, for co-development, for licensing. They don't really have standalone or independent venture capital teams. They don't. Another, a couple do. bioMérieux has a development. Becton Dickinson has a venture group, or did. Lumina has a venture group, but not a lot of them do. And so that makes it that much better. Yay! All right. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
No one knows what not to do there. Some recommendations on what to do with.
Yeah. So good assumptions are comprised of good market research to start. So when I think of our equity research analyst, the buy and sell in stock, what is that all about? So he's going to do fundamental due diligence on all of these things, right? He's going to rip the company apart. And he's going to look into all these, and it's not really a box-checking exercise, but he's looking for risks. There are so many unknowns about a company. So when you show up at a VC or an investor, you're not supposed to have all the answers and all the data. That's the purpose of their money, to spend it so that you can test and prototype and answer questions to figure out how you stack up and how competitive you'll be, right? But at the end of the day, you're trying your hardest to make assumptions based on the data you have. And you're trying also to be as conservative and as clear as possible as to what risks are what we call par for the course risks. Like, of course, you have clinical risks. You got a clinical risk. You got to run a clinical trial and not screw it up, right? But there are some risks that immediately jump out that you may need to be more conservative about in your model, or apply a higher discount rate or probability of you actually succeeding in tackling that risk. So all of that to say is your sales assumptions based on the size of a market and how many people in it and how much you're going to grab of it is all dependent on how differentiated you are, and based on things like physician surveys and key opinion leader conversations that can help mold and refine what your market addressed will be, what your penetration into that market will be. It's all based on the data you hope to generate and the FDA label that you will be allowed to sell into, right? So, putting a good financial model together has to do with, most importantly for a research stage company that doesn't yet make money, has to do with justifiable future revenue assumptions, which is based on all of these things, right? How do you know? Well, let's just assume that based on what we're developing, this is, how much it'll cost, and, our cure rate's this versus the competition, and we cost a little bit more and they cost a little bit less, but we're better, and we polled 10 physicians and 6 of them would use it, and whatever, right? So you build your revenue assumptions as best you can, and you build, as I mentioned, your COGS and your cost and your operational and distribution assumptions as best you can. And from that, your operational profit and your corporate overhead spits out, what your future profitability is, which is discounted back. So that's a pretty horrible answer to a good question. I'm sorry about that. Okay. I hope there's more questions. Yes.
So you kind of showed the difference in the value curve between drug and device. What cost? Where does the big investment have to happen along that line? The drugs, doing the trial. It sounds like the device. It may also be more than money maybe in
commercial. Yeah. Well, you've just answered it. So I'd say that in the drug space, or in most other medical product space, the major, well, actually, let me talk about something. You talk about cost. Let me introduce the concept of risk. The whole idea value going up is when risk goes down. But what's not shown here, which you all need to understand, is value is inversely proportional to risk. So the major de-risking event, even though here I've shown that every step of the way is a value-creating event for a drug company, if I really wanted to make the green line a little bit more curvy, the biggest value inflection point comes about here. In the clinical stage, when you demonstrate that you cured Alzheimer's or shrunk a tumor or whatever it is you're trying to do, right? And improved an outcome, depending on the strength of your data, depending on what everyone else in the world is doing. So that's that. And you're right. It's just investors presume that the largest risk of a medtech company is adoption and commercialization. And therefore, the greatest risk is at launch and commercial adoption, pricing, sales ramp, market penetration, and getting to profitability, which is probably where most device companies spend their most money. But it's this kind of valley of death for medical device companies, which is the hardest one to fund. Getting an investor to, once you have a prototype, to fund the clinical development is very hard, because they would say, okay, you're going to spend my money, and at the end of the day, is the company going to be worth more? You'll say yes, but the real answer is probably not, unless you're demonstrating something like, something really, really out there. But because medical technology is generally incremental innovation, it usually doesn't happen that way. So once a VC, that's why smart VCs like Lumira and IGAN and others, they're very disciplined about the valuations that they invest in at the prototype and at the clinical and at the pre-regulatory approval stage, because they know the fight hasn't even started. And they know more money is going to need to come in. And if they even model in a little bit of value accretion in those middle stages, they know that the biggest checks and the biggest risks are at the end.
In that context, you say, especially in the device space, different investors in the first 3 quarters of the journey in the last quarter.
There's generally no investors in the first part. Or a better way to say it is, if you're wise, you will find investors who will fund you, and no matter how the financing is tranched or split, milestone-based, you effectively need to find investors that will continuously fund you as you move along. Because unlike the drug space, as a comparator, there are venture capitalists that do the preclinical stuff. There are venture capitalists that do the clinical stuff. There's the public markets that will do the late clinical funding in the hundreds of billions. Whereas in medtech, it's pretty hard to find a lot of investors until you're really at the private equity stage, until you're at that, you actually have profit or ramping sales. And I don't care if it's Bo or Armin or Brian Courtney, they will tell you that they're all in what I have coined that awkward adolescent stage. Yes, Brian Courtney's in his adolescence, with respect to Conavi, right? He's in that, well, we have approval for this, we're doing a trial with this, and we've raised $30 million, and our value's more than that, but his big inflection, he's in that awkward middle teenagers. Even though he's a highly accomplished, cardiac surgeon, right? A brilliant guy. His company's in that mushy middle, and it's very, very tough to find investors. And if it was a drug company, that's not the case. You develop good data, and people imply, future success and future profits, and they're very happy to jump in when you've done, when you go from step to step. Yes.
So there is the reason that reason why people shift from investing into life drugs.
No, I don't want you to think that drugs are popular and medtech is unpopular. There are pools of capital for medtech, of course. It's just that the appropriate way. So the VCs that I know that fund medtech get in early or in the middle of the game, that they really have their eyes open as to what they're signing up for and the amount of time and the amount of capital that they need through to profitability. That's the point. Whereas I can go to a drug VC investor and I could pitch, look, we're going to fund to the end of phase 2. Not that we're going to put a big bow around it and sell it to Merck, and that, you know, we already know what our exit is, but it's just implied if we do a positive patient trial and generate the data that we're aiming to, that is clinically meaningful, the value of the company and the options for financing increase and expand. Whereas in medical technologies, or it's less so the case. Oh, it sucks there too. Oh yeah. No, I can't think of. Obviously Germany with their engineering expertise and their fancy automobiles and things. They're known as a device and instrumentation and engineering global center of excellence. But when I think of the startup, like we're talking about startups here, right? Like product-based small companies that want to save the world and save the whales and all that stuff. I don't think of Germany as, you know, the hotbed of that. Yeah, it's hard everywhere in medtech.
What you're describing and the experience, it sounds like the Medtech investor has much more domain expertise than some of the other investors, and they tend to be more engaged. And it tends to come to people who don't succeed in the year.
No, I would say the average medtech and the average other healthcare investor. Okay. Yes. So I would answer your question saying, of course, there's a huge universe of investors out there. Some can be duped, some can be told that you're changing the world, and but the ones that are highly specialized in them, there are less of them than there used to be. And yes, they are highly specialized and highly knowledgeable. I mean, on the drug side, you have highly knowledgeable investors. But there's more of them. Less people who engage in medtech innovation and funding than there used to be, because it's a hard game.
In that context, you say there's not a lot of M&A until the back end, but you have a sense that the big device companies are doing more on the investment side, like Johnson, Medtronic?
No, I think they're doing as much as they used to, but there's a truth in our industry that small medtech companies don't get bought until they're in that sweet spot of 20 to 40 million in revenue. Just, they're starting to penetrate lots of different countries, approaching profitability. That's the sweet spot. If you're a J&J in Ethicon, you say, okay, all right, fine. People are starting to buy this little kids thing. All right, good. All right, if we had that, we could sell it everywhere, right? And we'd do 400 million in sales on our global platform. That's their game. Whereas on the drug side, J&J finds a preclinical antibiotic that they like, they'll pump down $500 million from the data that is generated at that stage.
Machine learning software, how does that fall into this paradigm?
I think IBM is doing that with blockchain canvas. It's stuck in machine learning. I don't. Yes. Okay, so this is what I was afraid of in my speech. I don't want to discourage you all from... No, I'm serious. So medical technology development is a highly worthy cause. It's just that the bar is higher for you and the pool of investors is smaller, and therefore the clinical improvement that you're aiming for which is the result of what you're developing, needs to be that much better. And yet I said incrementalism is okay, which is also true. But the bigger point is the change and the improvement for the patient or the system or whatever that you're trying to introduce has to be that much better. Because, again, like any market, supply and demand, there's less eyeballs, less dollars, and higher risk. But like any market, there's a curve. And if you believe you're on the side of the curve where your value that you can create is enormous and the cost is reasonable and the time and the amount that you need to spend is defined and it is what it is, right? Whether it's 500 million or 5 million, you make the argument, this is what we'll be worth at the end, and and we're building towards that. There is no right or wrong time to approach an investor. I want to see companies at every stage along this chain, right? And there's no right or wrong time. In fact, it's very wise to engage intelligently with investors as an ongoing conversation, right? It's not a single pitch in a single moment in time, right? You can't unring a bell. If you look dumb in the first meeting, you won't get a second. But it's a long conversation, and it's a relationship that needs to be built, just like a personal relationship or a marriage, right? You're signing up to be partners with someone for, as I've just told you, in the medtech space, a long time. You may be partners with this investment group for 5 years or 10 years, maybe longer. So it's a courtship, and it's to build trust, and it's to share information, but you have to be prepared right from the start. Again, it goes back to my clinical, regulatory, and all those boxes that ultimately need to be satisfied to have a successful and valuable product or company. You don't need to have answers for all of those boxes. You need to have a well thought out plan to, go on a journey through development and through prototyping and through your commercialization process to be able to address all those things. Some can be guessed. Some is a shot in the dark, right? You won't know until the trial reads or until you treat a patient, and that's okay. But you need to be as informed as possible from your first conversation with a VC. And there's no such thing as too early with any investor. Yes.
The question is when you enter that system when IPO for next year, is there any platform for any on top of that?
Pardon?
So the company that you're looking to release an IPO for next year?
Yeah, that's a drug company. Yeah.
That's going to be, you can get information on that.
Yeah. I'll have my cards up front if any of you want to contact me afterwards. For all of you in cyberspace, just look me up online.
Thank you so much for this
Thank you.
presentation. Thank you for taking us through our innovators in the industry. Really very good insights. At least we can really take this impact on the
Yep. Can I leave on a high note? There's a lot of value to be created, a lot of difference that you can make for patients, a lot of wealth to be created for founders and for investors in the medtech space. Just because it's harder and the bar may be higher, all healthcare venture style pursuits, startups, investing, it's all risky. I mean, we're talking about the difference between ultimately 8% probability of success versus a 13% probability of success. It's all tough and it's all rare and scarce to find, for everything to happen the way it's supposed to happen and easily. And ultimately to find success, but it's all worth the pursuit. As scientists, as curiosity-driven people, as risk takers, and as biophysicists and engineers and people who like to solve problems. It's just that your business cases will be scrutinized, and you'll have less people to tell your story to. And therefore, you just have to be that much more prepared, and you need to be able to forecast that the value for the system or the patient or the disease you're treating or whatever it is, that your value is needs to be that better, higher, or better?